All right. So, modesty in the modern world. I'm curious just to start with, like, what does modesty mean to you? Yeah.
Well, there's a
Oh, go ahead, Marian.
there's in my world, the Spanish speaking world, the modesto is a name for a boy.
Oh, okay.
Modest means you don't interject yourself
Okay.
unnecessarily. You know when to hold them and when to fold them.
Okay.
That kind of thing. Modesto, modest, and that's a connotation that you keep your place. You give up other people the chance to speak, the chance to interact, and then you say your spiel.
Your spiel. Okay. Interesting. Julia, what were you going to say?
I know there's a school of thought that modesty has to do with how you dress yourself, but I think it should be more a behavior thing.
Okay.
And not flaunting yourself.
Okay. Can you give an example of like what would be modest versus immodest behavior?
I'm trying to think of a real life example that doesn't involve anybody in this conversation.
Okay.
Like when I am bragging about my Hamantash and how wonderful they are, that is not modest.
Okay. I see. All right.
And I would add, and it's kind of a restating what both Mario and Juliet said, modesty is not self-promoting.
Okay. Interesting. So this term modesty is like a little loaded, right? Because it's got all these connotations of like humility, but it also has all of this like cultural baggage, I guess, about how we dress and how we behave. Like not just sexually, but that's a lot of, I mean, obviously that's the topic for today because that's the context that we're having the conversation in, is this sexual ethics conversation. But there are a lot of rules that have developed over time in Judaism they're obviously not biblical, right? Because in the Bible, like everybody wore tunics. So like the concept of modesty is a little bit more of modest dress, I should say, is a little bit more modern-ish. But certainly like pretty codified laws have developed over time about what is considered modest. So elbows and collarbones covered, women in skirts, men in pants. You know, there's like a lot of enforced gendered clothing in a lot of the especially European, I get, like the Ashkenazi modesty rules. Knees covered, so no shorts, no short skirts, hair covered, whether that's a kippah or a black hat for a man, a shadel, the wig, or a tichel for a woman. Again, like very gendered woman. A yarmulke is not sufficient to cover a woman's hair in these conditions. So, what does that mean for Reform Jews? So I'm gathering from the three of you that maybe it doesn't mean anything, that if people behave modestly, they can wear whatever they want. Usually when people call me and ask like what is proper, or call the synagogue, I should say, they're not really calling me. I just happen to usually be the one here to answer the phone. They call the synagogue to ask what is like proper dress code for a synagogue. I say like, if you can wear it to public school, you can wear it here. It's just to say that like I would never kick someone out of the synagogue for what they wear, but I would think it was a little weird to come to a house of worship with like body parts hanging out, you know? So there are limits, right? It feels a little bit like the Lenny Bruce thing that like you don't know what profanity is until you hear it or something. What's that quote? Do you know what I'm talking about? Like
Yeah,
sometimes
it was Supreme Court Justice Blackmun in the days when the Supreme Court would look every Tuesday at pornographic films to decide which were covered by the First Amendment and which were not. And he had his famous quote was, "I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it."
okay. So I think there's some of that too with modest dress or immodest dress, that sometimes, and I think behavior does come into that. You know, it depends on how you carry yourself in certain clothing, but there are lines, and sometimes it's hard to define what those lines are. So to some degree, I understand the strictures, right? Because then we've got this slippery slope business. But at the same time, again, like I would never kick someone out of a synagogue for what they were wearing. So like maybe we don't really need any rules, and it's just like kind of a common sense thing. Like I also would not, I don't know. No, sorry. Actually, I'm not going to say this because we're being recorded and I don't know who watches this, but I'll say I wouldn't be pleased if someone brought pepperoni pizza into the synagogue. But I also know that most people in the synagogue don't keep kosher. And so like, does it really matter? You know, I wouldn't kick them out for it. Yes, Juliet.
First of all, I want to apologize for the bagel bites that are in the freezer.
Is that you?
That was me. I'm sorry.
Okay, it was not, I didn't want to put anyone on blast, but that is what I was about to say. It's like, I don't know who left those there.
It's my fault. I will get them out of there.
Okay.
I don't know what I was thinking when I picked them up, but well, I do know what I was thinking, but I wasn't thinking about kosher, but whatever. But the other thing I wanted to say is I remember some years back looking at an image of an Iranian magazine cover,
Mhm.
and in it was a woman with a burqa, and all you could see were her eyes, but they had some serious cat eye eyeliner on it, and she had these gold coins sewn onto her burqa. And for someone who was really covered up, she did not look modest.
Right.
She was flaunting it about as sexy as those rules could allow her to be. So, and then if you go to someplace like Savannah, where you look at those old homes, and they had the two stairways, one for the men to go up and one for the women to go up, because if a man caught a glimpse of the women's ankles, that would be shameful. He might even have to marry her. So they didn't even go up the same stairway to get into the house. So to say that modest is X type of clothing or whatever, right, it has no relevance. I think what you said, that if you would wear it in a public school, then you're good.
Yeah. Right, but there are basic dress codes at a public school too. Like you can't go topless, you know. So there are limits, and it's just, I think in a liberal context, using that religiously, not politically, it's harder to identify where exactly the line is, which I understand why that might be confusing for some people. But I agree that like then some of the other rules are they're so silly. Like you get these rules, but then you can still look sexy in other ways or whatever. And B, again, it's incredibly gendered, not only in the idea of like what counts as modest clothing for a woman and for a man are different, but also that like in Judaism, and I think this is true in Muslim cultures as well, where they, you know, a woman wears a burqa and a man also wears like flowy clothes and long sleeves and whatever and covers up. But and you know, in Judaism too, the wearing a suit, a black suit, everything's got to be black in the Haredi community anyway, not all Orthodox, but the more Orthodox, you know, so that it doesn't call attention to yourself. There are the men still dress modestly, whatever that means, right? Like they still cover up, but so much of the rules are really around like the women will be distracting, you know. In the book Sacred Encounter, there's a brief chapter on Kol Isha, which is the concept that a woman's voice is distracting. It comes from let me actually pull it up. I was looking at a different page to start the conversation, but I will pull it up. But it comes from a pretty small little line in the in the Torah, or is it the Tanakh? Anyway, and it's like, oh, page 21, not chapter 21. It's pretty simple. Like there's not a lot of meat to it. It's like a kind of a throwaway line that then got built up, you know, to be this whole thing where like women can't lead prayer and women have to hide behind the mechitza and like women can't pray too loud and like all of these things that especially we see how they play out like at the Western Wall in Israel, right? That like when women want to go have a women's service, I mean the Torah is like a whole other thing. When the women of the wall bring the Torah to the wall, that gets a big reaction, and those rules are slightly different than the Kol Isha. Like the reasons they think the woman can't hold the Torah are slightly different. And but there is also just like, even when they don't have a Torah, if women are just like being too joyful at the wall and the men can hear them, it's, you know, like forbidden. It's like all kind of made up, really. And this thing, Judith Z. Abrams, who used to be, wasn't she a rabbi at Ner Shalom forever ago? Early on? No? Okay. Debbie would know. She's not here. But Rabbi Judith Abrams has a short chapter. They're called personal reflections. So like at the end of each big topic, where there will be like 5 or 6 more academic essays, and there are these shorter, more personalized essays at the end of each one. So she's one of those shorter ones where she has this great line where she says like, so much of this, the way it's been built upon, this rule, is because of, you know, this concept of like how distracting women are to the men praying, and like that men are, you know, so easily turned on or whatever. Young men especially, like that's what he says, is something like, well, when I was 15, I'd have been distracted by a woman's voice, to which I, meaning Judith Abrams, replied, why should I have to shut up for the rest of my life because you used to be 15? Which is like such a great line. Like imagine if we conducted our whole lives because of how 15-year-old boys behave, or 15-year-old anybody. It's not a rational age. Like what? So here's the, oh, so here's the line. It is the Tanakh, not the Torah. It's Song of Songs, which we know is a like erotic poetry to begin with. So like, again, that's his point. But there's a line in it that says, "Sweet is your voice and your countenance is comely." So because of this, one of the early rabbis said, well, clearly the voice is so enticing and erotic that we should never hear a woman's voice. Like, are you, what? Talk about like cherry picking and pulling something out of context. So that's the whole thing behind Kol Isha. The voice of a woman is distracting. But I think that Rabbi Abram's response carries through for a lot of other like modesty rules and how gendered they are, that why should I have to wear a skirt to my ankles because you used to be 15? Why should I have to wrap a tichel instead of wearing a yarmulke because you used to be 15? What, you know? So all of these things I think still apply, a little bit vice versa. Like, why do men still have to wear those terribly uncomfortable looking black suits because they used to be 15 and like, you know, would have dressed like slobs if they didn't have a dress code? Is that really necessary? And I don't say that to demean people's choices. Like, plenty of Orthodox people are very smart, logically thinking, like they know what they're doing. They've made this choice and it adds meaning to their life. I don't mean to demean it wholesale, but just as such a, again, I just think we need to be honest about why we make the choices that we make religiously and where it really comes from. And I think there's a lot of, as much as there's a lot of like just kind of throwing babies out with bathwater, that's weird when you pluralize that metaphor. In Reform Judaism, I think there's a lot of like too much, well, we follow this rule because it's the rule in some Orthodox communities as well. And there's so much nuance in between. Yes, Juliet.
I think it's all related to blaming the victim. If a woman gets assaulted, oh, but she was out alone at night, then the crime is the woman is out alone at night and not assault.
Right. Yeah.
This is, being out alone at night is not cause rape. Short skirts do not cause rape.
Correct.
Drinking does not cause rape. Rapists cause rape.
Right. When there was a like string of assaults, of sexual assaults in Israel at one point, and one of the members of Knesset suggested that they should impose a curfew for the women to keep them safe. And Golda Meir said, no, we should impose the curfew on the men because they're the ones doing the raping. Just like no men can go out after dark until they get their stuff under control. And I liked that. She didn't enforce it. Nobody had a curfew. That was the end result. But by pointing out the, like, what do you mean no women can go out after dark? Like, that's ridiculous. So I do think that there is some of that in some of the modesty rules as well. The other aspect of modesty I wanted to talk about today is modest speech. So as I've mentioned a few times in these sessions, I've been listening to this podcast called Intimate Judaism, which is two modern Orthodox, I think modern Orthodox, definitely I don't know, people. One's a rabbi, one's a psychologist and sex therapist. And they talk about issues of sex and intimacy and things like that through a Jewish lens. And one of the things that they brought up in the episode I was just listening to this week which I also, the topic of that, I'm going to talk about the topic of that episode overall is going to inform more of next week's class. But they did bring up one thing, which is like, that felt relevant to today, which was like, if you want to even talk about sex and intimacy, sometimes it is embarrassing, it's considered immodest to even bring it up, it's all these things. But if you don't talk about it, then like it will be even worse when faced with the actions. Like, so they're talking in the context of older singles, like particularly divorced or widowed people who have already been, so they're talking in an Orthodox context. So the default for most people is shomer negia, like we don't touch unless we're married. These are people who have already been sexual, right? Because they were married and now they are no longer. And they're wondering, like, does shomer negia still really apply to me? I don't, like, I have kids. I don't really necessarily want to get remarried and have a blended family. That sounds messy, but I also don't want to just never be touched for the rest of my life. Like, how do I navigate this? And that even bringing it up to another Orthodox person could be like so taboo. But it made me think that there also was on a different podcast I used to listen to, there was an Orthodox sex therapist, different Orthodox sex therapist being interviewed. And she said a very common problem in some of the shomer negia communities is that because they're so afraid to ever even talk about it, because they never even like hold hands or kiss or whatever, they have no idea if they're compatible before marriage. And they don't even like, again, there's this gender issue where like the more prude a young woman appears, the more desirable she is as a wife. But then once they're married, then the man is like surprised that she doesn't want to have sex. And it's like, well, you married her because she was the prudest woman you knew. Like, what did you think was going to happen? So that there has to be, again, this like line of how can we talk about sexuality in a way that is not immodest, that's not like, you know, sharing details or anything like inappropriate, but that opens up conversations between potential partners that need to like be able to talk about it, that opens up conversations in communities so that people are comfortable just kind of like knowing what's in the realm of normal and healthy and what's not. You know, that's especially important for young people. Another one of the chapters in Sacred Encounters was about like Reform Jewish sex education and like needing to be able to like use biological terms for genitalia with teenagers and needing to be able to teach teenagers about consent and prophylactics and needing to be able to tell teenagers that like if you can't have the conversation with your partner about what birth control you're going to use, or if that feels good, that doesn't feel good, then you are not ready to have sex. Like that is important, to be able to just say certain things, but it feels super awkward to say certain things. So like, where is the modesty line on that? I don't have an answer, but like, that's another thing that I think is relevant to this conversation. So if you have thoughts, bring them in. Okay. One other chapter. There were only 3 really chapters in Sacred Encounter that dealt significantly with modesty. One was Judith Abrams' Why Should I Shut Up Because You Used to Be 15. One was a more academic chapter on what to wear in a Reform synagogue, which we can talk more about, but it basically is what we just talked about. And one is, Rabbi Dahlia Marks um, who she edited one of the other books we read, or that I read, and that we used for an adult ed, The Life of Meaning, the Reform Jewish like guide to practice. I did not realize that she is Israeli, but she talks about raising her kids in Israel and how much in Israel, because so much is controlled by the Orthodox in certain parts, like in Jerusalem especially, like any image of women is like blocked out. There's a meme page on, I think, Facebook, maybe Instagram, that's like Orthodox images that are inadvertently super gay, and it's because they don't show women in advertisements or anything. Like they're so afraid of just like the countenance of a woman, even in her full Haredi garb or whatever, just like a woman's face in print is too alluring. So they'll have like advertisements where they want to show like a happy family around a Shabbat table, but it's two men because they can't have a woman in the picture. But they also wouldn't have two men married in a household in those communities. Anyway, it's funny. Anyway, so Dahlia Marks has a personal reflection in the book where she's talking about some of that, and then there's a scene where one of her, I think it's a little unclear, I think one of her daughter's teachers, but anyway, she says a male teacher at an ultra-Orthodox school for girls in Israel entered his classroom of adolescents holding a platter of steaming warm raisin pastries in his hand. He took a piece of pastry, said the appropriate blessing, and in front of his amazed students, he bit into one of the cakes. He said, this arouses your appetites, doesn't it? He said. And that's how I feel when you all don't dress appropriately. So, first of all, the message there is problematic in itself, right? That like women are not pastries. But also, if a teacher says that, he needs to be fired because he just said that he wants to have sex with his students. Like that's not appropriate. I don't care how they dress. That's immodest. So like what, so again, that it highlights to me what is like, where is the line on modesty? Because they may or may not have been dressing modestly, but his behavior is overtly, like his statement was overtly sexual. And with the power differential of a teacher and a grown man to a room full of adolescent girls, that's wildly inappropriate. So I think that although in Reform communities, we don't have some of these issues, like we don't have strong dress codes, we don't have concepts of necessarily such strict gender roles and appropriate like gendered clothing. And women can wear pants, people can wear short sleeves, like whatever, but I'm not sure that we've completely unpacked some of the wider questions of modesty, appropriate behavior and things to say, while still opening up space for like difficult conversations or like space for adolescents to ask important questions about their bodies and things like that. Because if we talk about our bodies as gifts from God, then we also have to like be affirming of all the things that the body does and feels, but find the like appropriate inroads to have those conversations, or to leave the door open for those conversations to take place in healthy ways. And I think that's the balance that unfortunately the modesty in Reform synagogues chapter doesn't really, I mean, because they're just talking about dress, really. Dress codes. What is it called? Hold on. I had it open. Unplanned fatherhood. Sorry. What not to wear, synagogue edition. Yeah, so they're talking really specifically about clothing. But I think there's so much more to what makes something modest than just clothing. I mean, and you all said it. The last, I guess, really Jewish specific thing I want to touch on is so modest culture, whatever, in Judaism is called tzniut or tznius. It's like, you know, the Hasidic community would say tznius. Same word, it's just a Yiddish versus modern Hebrew inflection. Tzniut. And usually when we talk about it, we are talking about clothing choices or about like overtly sexual behavior. But I realized one day that it is the same word as in that famous verse from the prophet Micah, what does God want from you? Only to do justice, do good, act righteously, and walk humbly with your Lord. That word for humble there is tznius. It's tzniut. It's that same, you know, that tie between humility and modesty is still there in the Hebrew itself. And I just thought that was interesting. And I have not ever really had an opportunity to like unpack that. I came upon it kind of by accident. I was looking for sources about tznius, about modest dress, and just like typing the keyword in, that verse popped out or came up in the list. And I was like, it's not what I'm looking for, but that is interesting. And I'm just going to tuck that away for a later time. So here's the time that I'm bringing that up. I guess, what is the connection that you see between humility and modest dress or like sexually modest conversation, behavior, whatever? Go ahead, Alex. Yeah.
When I think of humility, I think and in terms of modesty, I don't think of dress. I think of actions. I think of what you say and what you do, not how you dress. So I'm kind of not, I'm thinking dress is a different type of modesty. It's still modesty, but it's a different type of modesty. So I'm not associating humility with dress. And I'll just note that if you go back to Adam and Eve, they were modest until they weren't modest until they figured out they needed to be modest. But
that's actually how this chapter on what not to wear in the synagogue starts. Now the two of them were naked, the man and his wife, for they were not ashamed. And then they eat the fruit and realize that they are naked and immediately feel shame and make themselves clothes out of their fig leaves. So like, I don't know what that teaches us about the human body and needing to cover it up, but there's clearly something there.
But also to Micah's, the quote from Micah, how to put this, we're all made in God's image. God knows absolutely what we look like, whether we've got clothes on or not.
Go ahead, Juliet.
I'm going to venture you can't wear an outfit made out of fig leaves to a public school or a synagogue.
I guess it depends on
So
how many
whatever
fig
was modest for them clearly doesn't cut it nowadays. Also, I was thinking back to when I was in high school
Mhm.
in Miami, Florida, where there were a great many Cuban children as well. Now, these Cuban young women in their teens, they would come to school wearing tube tops. It was Miami, Florida. It was never cold. They wore tube tops or halter tops or whatever. We didn't have a dress code banning it. So they were not modestly attired. But I will tell you, these same girls did not go on a date without a chaperone. They'd never kissed a boy. They may have had full makeup on, but they weren't strutting and flirting. They just felt that they should be their most beautiful self at all times. And this was their idea of their most beautiful self. And their parents clearly didn't agree, or they'd have put their foot down. So what's modest here? The way they act,
Mhm.
or are they immodest because of how they dress?
Years ago, I was in St. Martin, which there's a French side and a Dutch side to the island. Went to the beach, and it was on the French side of the island, and so there were a certain number of people who were nude.
Yeah.
And truth be known, 98% of them, the thought crossed my mind, why don't you put some clothes on? Too much. The visual wasn't very was anyway, but I mean, it's a French attitude that nudity is not a bad thing, and it's not like they were having sex on the beach
Right.
and or anything like that. They were just there to sunbathe, maybe go in the water, just do what you do at a beach.
Yeah. I would be, I think personally mortified just because of my own cultural upbringing and whatever, to be at a nude beach. But in theory, I understand it. Like bathing suits are not very comfortable. You don't like tan lines are not very attractive. It feels good to have the sun on your whole body. Sweat, like I get it. I don't know, but I just don't think I could ever do it. Much like I understand why some women do feel a need to cover up completely. I don't want to ever do that either. Wear a burqa or something, or a shadel, but I, I understand why that's appealing to some people. Mario, how about you? What do you think?
So I believe I got lost with the conversations somewhat. You're drawing the connection between modesty and humility.
Yes, yeah,
You asked that. That was your question.
that's the question.
Yeah, to me, the connection between modesty and humility is that I'm humble. I rules. I'm subservient to rules such that the humbleness that ensues from rules makes me act modest. In other words, if what I'm trying to say is that if it were up to me, I'd do certain things,
Uh-huh.
and that comes from the but being conscious of other people, I'm humble enough that I am modest. I follow the mode.
Mm-hmm.
I follow the mode that's been laid out.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'm trying to somehow or other, the image of my cousin and me when we were little comes to mind.
Okay.
And we were maybe 4 years old. I remember way back there. I have a good long-term memory. It's my short term that's that's watering down, that's fading.
Classic.
But my long-term memory is excellent. And I can remember back to I was when I was 4 or 3, or even, somewhere around there, 4 probably. And I remember my cousin being dressed in white, and I touched her or something, and my aunts were just up in our arms about that I shouldn't be touching her. Even I had no idea that it was sexual or whatever. Probably it was just touching my cousin because she was a person,
Yeah.
much like I would touch somebody with a handshake or whatever. And the modesty is very, very strong in Mexican culture. The distinction, the difference between man and woman, even in this case, child and child. So those are the images that come to my mind about modesty, that observing proper behavior, being humble to what proper behavior is. There you go, I got it now. Being proper, being subservient to what society has dictated proper behavior to be. There's the humility part.
Yeah. It's interesting, that connection
Yeah.
between humility and subservience.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
think
because if it
in
were up to me, I'd do a lot of things that are outlandish.
okay.
That are outlandish. But the humility to rules, regulations, mores, modes uh, require me
Yeah.
to be humble and therefore be modest. I think it goes in a circular way.
It makes me think, what you just said makes me think about Juliet's point earlier about following a custom to dress in a way that is perceived as appropriately modest, but in a way that still calls a lot of attention to oneself, and in that sense is like maybe not so modest, but it's not revealing, I guess. And how we how we compare conflate those two concepts as like revealing equals immodesty, so covering up equals modesty. And that concept of being subservient to, like, that humility is subservience to rules. So if that's your cultural custom, then that's
Yeah.
the subservience to rules, and that's that's still the modesty, that's the marker. It's
Let me
true
give you another
also.
example, Rabbi Liz, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Something just, if I may interrupt you, is that okay if I interrupt you?
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember from high school.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, again, my cultural upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't dance the what do you call that? The twist or rock and roll, or we kept the polkas. They're called polkas in Spanish.
Okay.
And so when a couple would start doing that, what I mean is start doing rock and roll or twist or something like that, everybody would gather around that couple in a gym.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody would gather around. So I guess they were being flagrant. They were being immodest and not following cultural rules. That we just didn't do that. We were too Mexicanized. We weren't anglicized enough to permit us to do twists or rock and roll. And whenever a couple deviated from that, everybody would gather around that couple, form a circle, not of disapproval, but of like remarking, wow, they're doing this, which is against cultural norms. Then they're being immodest. I'm not sure that the modest fits now.
Well,
Yeah.
it's in, oh, go ahead, Alec.
Yeah, and those cultural norms are like Juliet was talking about what the Cuban girls in Miami would wear, or what I was talking about, the people on the beach in St. Martin. Um, they're not ashamed of them. Clearly, they're not ashamed of themselves in any way, but also that's what they wear at the beach. I guarantee, I didn't ask any of them, but I guarantee if any of them were to go to church or synagogue, they would not be going naked. So, I
Right.
mean,
Yes.
I want to draw a little parallel to what Alex said. When I taught in Mexico, boy, I'll tell you, Mexican women are so easy to meet. They'd ask me for my phone number, and yet they were very, very modest in their behavior.
Okay.
But to meet them, it was like so easy, very, very different. If I may, I think I can say this in polite terms. I went to a dance in a city in Mexico called Torreon, beautiful city, beautiful, beautiful city. And I started dancing with a girl there, and she, we did multiple dances, which signifies interest. And she asked me what I thought of virginity.
Okay.
Yeah. So obviously she had sex, and
Right.
that is a very, very looked down activity, and particularly in those days.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much it is now, but the hint was, would you like me even though I've had sex? Because out of the blue, she asked that. So there's another, that's humility, modesty. I don't know which one would identify it, but she did ask me that. I've thought of that so many times.
I think so. That's interesting to me because, first of all, that's the kind of question that the podcasters that I was talking about earlier were kind of talking about. I mean, obviously, the context is different because if we're talking about two previously married people, presumably none of them are still virgins because they were married, they have kids, whatever. But it's that kind of like overt sexual, like trying to test the waters, like, are you looking for the same thing I'm looking for? Like, kind of question that could immediately scare off another partner. Like, why would you even ask that? You know,
Mhm.
like that's not modest. But on the other hand, I do think it is a sign of humility to ask because it shows that that person isn't interested in misleading you or like does want to make sure you're like on the same page as you're scoping out your interest in one another. And that's healthy and
I
normal.
think I think what she was asking, Rabbi Liz, is, do you still respect me?
Yeah. But I think that that's an important question. Like, I
Mhm.
mean, I don't know, you're just dancing together. Maybe it's jumping the gun a little bit, but as you said, it indicates interest before she wants to, give you her number or whatever, go on a real
Yeah.
date. She needs to
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
will
Yeah.
you respect her? And I
Yeah.
think it's
Do
very
you still
valid.
respect me? I violated a social norm.
Yeah.
I I violated a social norm. I've had sex before marriage. This is way back there. So she says, she's telling me I violated a social norm. I've had
Right.
sex before marriage, or even before I've had sex before marriage. Let's leave it at that. Do you still respect me? Do you still want me? Are you still interested?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the kind of question that gets at the heart of this topic of like, what is modesty? Because I think some people would think that even to bring it up is immodest. I think it's an important uh thing to discuss with a potential dating partner
Hmm.
or more partner. Um, and that it, yeah. So I don't know. I think that this topic, I mean, there are, like I said in the beginning, there are some very clear rules in certain communities. But whereas with a lot of the other topics, I think as Reform communities, we have other values that very clearly dictate how we navigate those other rules, like around who we think can get married, and what makes a family, what makes a healthy relationship, which actually what makes a healthy relationship, mostly as Reform Jews, we're still on the same page as Orthodox Jews. It's just a matter of what two kind of people can have a healthy relationship. But all of those things feel pretty clear. This topic feels a little bit more ambiguous to me. And I think, I don't know, I hope that that's not like, that doesn't leave you all feeling kind of disappointed. But I feel like it's been interesting to talk with you all for this hour about humility versus modesty and where we draw the line and how we determine that in our own congregation. And I don't know, personally, I'm not really interested in having a dress code at Ner Shalom any more than, if you can wear it to public school, you can wear it here. But I'd be open to the conversation if other people felt like there was immodest dress or behavior happening at Ner Shalom.
No, I don't think that. Everything's fine.
Good.
Yeah. I just want to draw one more thing that perplexes me, troubles me.
Okay.
And I know I'm not alone.
Okay.
And that is a father giving his daughter
Like at a wedding,
at a wedding.
giving her away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The sexual activity is going to ensue.
Right.
It bothers the father. I know, because it bothers. It's in the back of my mind, and it's other fathers that I've talked to. It's the same thing. So I'm perplexed at that, because I've raised my daughters to
Yeah.
the best of my ability, and now they're theirs. They're their own.
Yes.
And yet there's always this. There's this little prod that about giving the daughter away.
I mean, it comes from an archaic tradition, right? Where literally the father was giving his daughter or selling her, basically, right? Like there was a bride price, a dowry, whatever. Women didn't have much agency of their own. Or at least sexual agency belonged to their fathers and then to their husbands. So that's the origin of that, which is, so I don't really understand why anybody still does it, to be honest. But some people find it very meaningful to have their father walk them down the aisle. Some fathers find it very meaningful to walk their daughters down the aisle. I guess I never thought of it from the father's perspective. I've only ever thought of it from the daughter's perspective, or just like as a general concept. Like, this comes from a weird place. Why are we still doing this? But it's interesting that as you bring that up, that it's weird for the father too. Like, why am I getting this fully grown woman to another man? Like, she's still herself.
I don't. My thinking. Why am I feeling this way? If my fully grown woman, a daughter,
Yeah.
is going to engage in sexual activity, what? It's in the back of my mind. I wouldn't say it bothers me.
Right. But it just kind of like
Quite natural, but
freaks you out a little bit in the back of your head.
But even that's not. It didn't freak me. It's in the back of my mind. It doesn't freak me out. It's just in the back of my mind. It's a thought that doesn't belong there. There you go. It's the thought that doesn't belong there. My daughters are my daughter. They're fully grown, full human beings to do their own volition.
Yeah.
And yet I feel that way, the particular way that she's a part of me and she's going to engage in sex. And I think maybe, it may be cultural, a little bit of it may be cultural. Keep bringing back my Mexican heritage, but I bet you it has something to do with that too.
Yeah. I know you only have daughters, but do you think you would feel that way about sons too?
No, I would not. And I would have known exactly. I'm raising my daughter was a beautiful adventure.
Hmm.
I didn't know what to expect. Had I had a son or sons, I would have known what to do. I would have known how to exactly what my part in raising him would be. But having daughters was a wonderful, beautiful adventure into the unknown. I just didn't know what entailed raising daughters.
Juliet, as a mom, do you have any of that same thought? Or is that like a dad-daughter thing? You're muted. I can see you getting ready to talk. There you go.
All I wanted for my daughter was for the same thing I wanted for my son, not to just do it to do it, to be with someone they cared about, and for it to be consensual.
Mhm.
But I didn't have special feelings that I needed to protect my daughter. Well, other than I didn't want her to be assaulted, but as far as what she should do consensually, I was not telling her different things than I was telling my son. I didn't have a double standard.
Wait,
But I do remember an incident that a girlfriend of mine, I was giving her a ride and she just had the one daughter. And around the time her daughter was 12 or 13, she was telling me about a horrible dream she had where her daughter was sexually assaulted and how disturbing this dream was to her. And did I think it meant anything? And I said to my friend, every woman who has a daughter has that dream when their daughter is at a certain age. It just happens. You know it's a thing and you dream about it, but it's not foretelling that anything bad is happening to your daughter. It's just you're a mom and you worry about your daughter. Just you wait, Liz.
What do you think, Alec?
When I got married, both of my parents walked me down the aisle, and I thought it was a
wow,
beautiful thing.
That's lovely.
yeah, that's great.
We didn't have enough of a wedding for anyone to walk me down the aisle. There wasn't an aisle. We just stood in a circle basically under the chuppah or around the chuppah. So I mean, my dad would have wanted to if I had a bigger wedding. But it's a weird, I don't know. It comes from a weird place.
Do you all have time? I'd like to interject something that I'd like to interject something a little bit out of
Okay.
bounds from what we've talked, but that it really has to do with this. Okay, like I've thought about rape. What is rape? Rape, um, to me, what I've come up with is it's that it's violent, it's domination. Doesn't have to be with how attractive a woman is, with how sexy she is. It has to do with domination, with humiliation of
Mm-hmm.
women. And I'm wondering if anybody can offer help in terms of I know it's humiliation, but why? Why is it innate in some men to humiliate somebody like that?
I don't know, but I believe it's innate. I think it's learned behavior, either from their own trauma that, hurt people, or from behaviors they saw their fathers or other men around them engage in. There's often like cycles of abuse that happen, that engage in it. And there's also a lot of like cultural messages. There there was like a little bit of a scandal recently with a YouTuber Philip and I like, who's like a geek. Like he's got a big, I don't know if he's actually Jewish. I don't think he is based on his name, but I don't know. But he's got like kind of like a big white boy fro and like acne and like he's a geek. Probably didn't get a lot of girls in high school. And now that he's like a known YouTuber and he's really funny and like whatever, he was getting invitations to hang out with girls, or he'd ask, or like female fans would DM him, direct message him, and he'd be like, oh, actually, I'm coming through your area. Can I crash with you this night? Blah, blah, blah. And then he would like pressure them into sexual behavior. And after some of the women came forward with like how uncomfortable it was when he would stay with them and do everything, he issued an apology video that I think was one of the most genuine apology videos of these sort of like Me Too moments that I've ever seen. Because first of all, I think it helps that he wasn't actually accused of rape. He was accused of like sexually coercive behavior, which is like on a line, right? Like it's not okay, but it is different than the big R. And he said like I've seen this in movies that like that's what awkward funny guys do. You like poke and pester and joke until she gives, like, I thought that was what I was supposed to do. And I didn't realize that I was hurting people, and I'm sorry, and I'm gonna like do some reading and like get some help with unpacking this. And it was it just felt really genuine, because I do think that there's so much messaging around that kind of stuff of like how sex is supposed to unfold, and that women are supposed to say no first, and you're supposed to have to convince them, and all of this that leads to these situations that are actually pretty coercive. And again, obviously that's different than the sort of violent, humiliating, like stranger rape, but it still feels violating for the women it happens to, and it's very common. And I think there's just so much like social programming around that we have to work on unpacking. And that's again one of those things that like so that's why we have to be comfortable talking about sex and consent in like synagogue spaces, when we're talking about values and like human worth and things like that there has to be space for that, even if it feels immodest to be talking about sexual relationships in a synagogue. Like, I don't know when it would come up necessarily. Like just hanging around the oneg table, like, hey, so did you ask consent for your last sexual encounter? Like, I don't know that we're going to have that conversation, but like it needs to be more comfortable than it currently is, so that we can open up the space for people who aren't sure if like something was uncomfortable. Was that okay that happened to me? Or like, like whatever, like I'm engaging in this behavior that I've seen on TV, but like I don't see it necessarily in couples that I know, like long-term couples. So like, is this why I don't have a girlfriend? And like whatever it is, we need to be able to open up those conversations more.
The fact that we're prefacing our remarks as we speak here indicates modesty.
Right.
Indicative of modesty. And one of the most, see, I'm prefacing, I'm searching for words.
Mm-hmm.
Even I'm prefacing right at this moment. One of the moments that stuck in my mind so much was from a series a few years ago called World at War. Did anybody ever see that? World at War. It was about World War II and the experiences of soldiers and people that were caught up in World War II. This German lady was in Berlin at the time when the Russians invaded Berlin. Yeah, made it to Berlin. And she said, well, I meant this, the Russian came in and raped me. And then she laughed about it. She said, he raped me. And then he started to cry. Wow.
Yeah.
Isn't that a conflict of emotions that not only that he would cry, but at the same time that she would laugh. She would
Yeah.
make a moment so impressionable, make it into such a lighthearted moment.
Yeah. I think some people laugh as a nervous reaction. And I also I don't think necessarily crying after assault is that, I mean, I have no idea how common it is, but it doesn't strike me as that surprising because I have read lots of studies about, like, your brain does not want to believe that you are a bad guy.
I see.
So when you do a bad thing, you either, well, not either, usually it's a combination of these things, that you make excuses, you feel remorse, you go through the emotions of like grief about your action, and then you make excuses for why what you did was justified or why it wasn't really the thing that it was. So like in the case of rape, there's a really good article by some Jewish feminist. I'm not going to remember who it was, and you're probably not going to ever go look for it, so it doesn't matter. But there's a really good by a Jewish feminist academic about the rape of Dinah, and how after it, you know, the prince comes and wants her hand in marriage. And it's like clear in the narrative and to her as like also a psychologist or sociologist or whatever her secular degree is, that he doesn't see himself as having committed rape. It's unclear in the text if she sees it that way. It's clear her father and brothers see it that way. And it's clear that the prince does not see it that way, that he sees that himself as having engaged in a sexual encounter. And like maybe consent is just like not on his mind at all because, you know, women are objects in the Bible. But he clearly does not see himself as having hurt this woman at all. And he's like enjoyed his sexual encounter and he wants to marry her. And she talks about like how some of that's whatever, it's a parable, it's like a story. We don't know if Dinah was a real person. Like there's all these other things that story sets up with the sons of Jacob and everything. But also like psychologically, it tracks that would be his response, and like how that all unfolds for the prince and the king of Shechem. I think it was very interesting. Yeah, we did start a little late, so I wanted to give you know, time to finish the conversation, but now we are at quarter after, so I'm gonna
Well, in
end
the
it
interest
here.
of humility, one last thing, I brought up the topic of rape, which is a very, very sensitive issue. And
Yes.
in following the lines of humility, I want to apologize to for opening up, if anybody is offended for opening that line. It's a very sensitive issue. And I recognize that, but I thought I'd take advantage of the group being together.
I appreciate that. I think we're I didn't get the sense, and you know, you're all welcome to message me afterwards if you felt offended. I can, you know, fix it later, but I didn't get the sense that that's true. But I appreciate your disclaimer, and I will, when I put the recording on YouTube, I will put something in the description in case there are people for whom that would be triggering. So thank you. All right, we'll see you next week for the final one, where we will talk about sexual desires. Modestly. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.